Local history, local culture, local events, your community. This is the Joe Kelly Show.
Hi there, everybody. Welcome to the show. Cheryl Pula is our guest. Cheryl is a prolific author in this area, and she's out with a new book, and it's the Little Bighorn, Custer's Last Battle. We're going to be talking to her about that and other things, but first we're going to say welcome. Good to see you again.
Same here.
The Custer's battle, the last battle, of course, we're talking about the battle at the Little Bighorn, yes?
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. Yep.
What got you interested enough with, it wasn't General Custer, was it? He didn't have that rank at the Little Bighorn, did he?
No, he was Colonel Custer.
Yeah.
He'd been given a brevet or a temporary promotion to general during the Civil War.
Mm-hmm.
But once the war was over, anybody who had one of these temporary commissions reverted back to the rank that they had prior to that. And his was Lieutenant Colonel. So he was actually Colonel Custer.
The Lieutenant Colonel, not just a colonel.
Yeah.
Huh?
Yeah.
He talking about the Civil War, Custer was really distinguished himself, did he not, during the Civil War?
Oh yeah, that's how he got the promotion. In fact, until a guy named Galusha Pennypacker came along, Custer was the youngest general they had in the Civil War. He was something like 22 or something when he became a general, because he was known for his daring do, doing stuff that other people wouldn't attempt to do.
Yeah.
And leading his men. He was always at the front of the charge or whatever when he led his men, like at Gettysburg. He was involved in the only cavalry battle at Gettysburg.
That personality, I guess, led to the Little Bighorn, yes?
Oh yeah, yeah. They were going to do a three-pronged campaign, if you will, to try and drive the Plains Indians all into one place so they could basically either get rid of them or put them on a reservation. And Custer was going to be one of the guys leading one of the attacks, but he got into a little trouble with the law, shall we say, prior to that. So they put Alfred Terry in command of the part of the campaign he was going to be involved in, and Custer was like the second in command, but he was in command of the 7th Cavalry.
Right. Was the trouble that Custer got himself into involving being away from the post without permission?
Well, kind of, yeah. He had been called to Washington, D.C. to testify against some of the Indian agents who were getting rich off of the Indians, and Custer had reported it. So President Grant, ex-General Grant, had called him to Washington to testify. Well, as Custer was testifying, he not only implicated the Secretary of the Interior, who was in charge of the Indian Affairs things, Belknap, in this whole conspiracy to make money off of the Indians. He also implicated Grant's brother Orville. So Grant ordered Custer to stay in Washington so he could talk to him about this. Custer got tired of waiting around, so he basically went AWOL to go back to join the 7th Cavalry for this campaign that they were planning against the Indians. And the law caught up with him in Chicago and put him under arrest. Grant ordered him back to Washington, but General Sheridan, who was in overall charge of this whole thing, wired to Grant and said, we need Custer, we can't do this campaign without him, and persuaded Grant to let him go. And as they say, the rest is history. He ended up at the Little Bighorn, and that was it.
It amazes me as you think back. I mean, today we hop on a plane and we're somewhere in a matter of hours, but back then, to go from Washington to here, I mean, you're talking about long.
Oh yeah, days if not weeks to get somewhere, yeah.
And the battle was, for those who don't know where the battle took place.
Yeah, it was in Montana, on what is now the Crow Indian Reservation, the land there. And if you go up there to the Little Bighorn, you have to go through a Cheyenne reservation to get there. Yeah, but it's in Montana, kind of like southwestern Montana.
Did they, I know at one point, I don't know if it's still the case, they had crosses at the battle where the soldiers fell.
Yeah, they put crosses originally, but now they're like, well, if you go to Arlington, you see those little white headstones, the marble headstones, that's what they've got. And it's very unique from all battlefields, because they have one of those little monuments every place a trooper fell, including Custer. The only difference is Custer's, the front of the monument has like a black background, so you can read the white writing saying this is where Custer fell, kind of thing. But they have all these little headstones all over the prairie. And there's hardly any trees, and it's very kind of eerie being there, because you can look out and you can see this whole thing.
And where is Custer buried?
He's buried at West Point.
And I'm trying to think of my history. Was he at the top of his class or at the bottom of his class?
Dead last.
Dead last, okay, yeah.
I thought it must run in George's, because
Yeah.
George Custer was last in his class, and George Pickett of Gettysburg fame, he was also dead last in his class. So.
Who was was it his wife, and we can talk about her later, but
Libby, yeah.
Was it her that got him back to West Point to be buried?
I believe so, yeah. Yeah, it used to be, because she's buried at West Point too. It used to be, if you were a graduate of West Point or whatever, you could be buried there. And that's where she wanted him to be buried, because that's where he went to school. And she was buried there too. Now, several years prior to her passing away, which was in the 1930s, so she outlived him by quite a bit, wives could not be buried at West Point. And people sometimes ask me, the old question, who's buried at Grant's tomb?
Yeah.
And I'll say Grant and his wife Julia. And they say, well, why is he buried in New York City when he's from Ohio? And I said, well, he wanted to be buried at West Point, because that's where he went to school. And he wanted her to be buried with him. Well, when she passed away at that time, wives could not be buried with their husbands at West Point. So he knew that, and he put in his will that if she can't be buried at West Point, then I want to be buried wherever she chooses. And New York City was the last place that the two of them had lived together, so she picked New York City. That's why he's buried in New York.
And for a long time, the big rule at West Point was you had to be a West Point graduate to get into that cemetery.
Yeah, a big exception to the rule is Dan Butterfield from Utica, who wrote Taps. He's buried at West Point, but he didn't go to West Point, but he ended up being a general during the Civil War and a Medal of Honor recipient in that.
And not to get too much onto Butterfield, but it was his wife, who was a Lorillard, who pulled some strings, so to speak, to get him in there. Yeah.
And when you go there today, he's got the biggest monument.
Yeah, and if I recall correctly, Cheryl, she when she got him into West Point graveyard, they said, the superintendent or somebody down there said, well, we'll put up a suitable monument. And she said, that's okay, I'll put it up.
Yeah, I'll do it, yeah.
Yeah, and that's what it ended up with. Okay, when we come back, there's a local connection to the Battle of Little Bighorn from New York Mills, where you're from. We'll talk about that when we come back. Cheryl Pula is our guest. We're talking about her new book, The Little Bighorn, Custer's Last Battle. Short break, right back. And welcome back, everybody. Thanks for sticking with us. Cheryl Pula is our guest. Cheryl is a very prolific author, and she's a lecturer as well. She goes around the area giving talks about a variety of topics, and how you keep it all in your head, Cheryl, is beyond me. But her newest book, The Little Bighorn, Custer's Last Battle, was the 7th Cavalry. Was their, not theme song, but was their song, the Gary Owen?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. That's an Irish song, isn't it? The
Yes,
Gary
it
Owen?
is, yeah.
Yeah.
It's like a pub song,
Yeah.
sort of, kind of like our national anthem was at one time a pub song, yeah.
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 And there's I forget, it was an Errol Flynn movie, but
They died with their boots on.
yeah.
Yep.
And in that movie, there's a scene where Errol Flynn playing the role of George Custer, hears that song in a pub and says, "That's it for us. We're going to take that song."
Yeah, that was kind of like their official marching out of camp, marching out of the fort kind of song. Yeah, Custer really liked that song.
There's a local connection to the Battle of Little Bighorn, New York Mills,
right?
Where you're from.
Yes.
What's the connection?
Well, when Custer arrived at the area of the Little Bighorn, he divided his command into three. One section under him, one section under Captain Benteen, and one section under Major Marcus Reno. There were three surgeons with Custer. One was with his group, two of them were with Reno's group. Now, Reno tried to attack the southern end of the village, but the Indians counterattacked, if you will, and drove them back onto these bluffs. Now, one of the surgeons was killed during that retreat. The second one wasn't, and he was from New York Mills. His name was Henry Ronaldo Porter, and if you go through New York's Mills today, they're right off of Main Street, there's Porter Street, and it's named after his family, and his house is still on the street. Yeah.
Ronaldo, that's a
odd
name.
Yeah, I think it might have been like a family name or something, but I'm not quite sure.
How many Union forces were killed at the battle?
The number I hear repeated most often were that there were 220 or 222 with Custer. They were all wiped out. Now with Reno, I think there was about 40 or 50 who were wounded, and maybe 20 or 30 who died. But a lot of the wounded, they credit Dr. Porter with saving, because he was there pretty much under shot and shell like they were. And they had taken like the bodies of some dead horses and made like a little enclave where he could treat the wounded. So they credit him with saving a lot of the wounded from Reno's command.
Did Dr. Porter ever get back to New York Mills?
Oh yeah. He got back here. He had trained at Georgetown, by the way, outside of DC. And he eventually got back here. Yeah.
Did he practice medicine in New York Mills?
I believe he did.
Yeah. On the Indian side, how many died? Do we know?
Not really, because the Indians tended to collect their dead and take them with them. And the most figures that I hear repeated more often were like 15 Cheyenne. And actually it was the Cheyenne who did away with Custer, not the Sioux. The Sioux came in kind of at the end and mopped up, sort of thing. But about 15 Cheyenne and maybe 10 or 12 Sioux, so probably about 25 altogether.
Boy, that astonishes me that the number was so small.
Yeah. Well, you got to remember the Indians had the upper hand in everything, because Custer was under the assumption that he and his 7th Cavalry were out there and the Indians didn't know it. Well, the Indians knew the minute they left Fort Lincoln to go west, the Indians knew they were out there, and they were keeping track of them, even though Custer and his men didn't see them. The Indians knew the territory, and they knew the places where they could, the best places to engage somebody in a battle kind of thing. And so they had all the advantages, the Indians did.
Including their armament. They were, the Indians had repeating rifles, and Custer's men did not. Is that correct?
That's correct for most part, yeah. The repeating rifles thing, they could go to the Indian agencies out there and buy or barter for modern weapons. And just before the Battle of the Little Bighorn, they had been involved with another prong of this three-pronged attack at the Rosebud Creek. And they won that one. The soldiers retreated, and they left their rifles on the battlefield. So the Indians just came in and they picked up the rifles and the ammunition that were there, and that's what they used when they were in the battle against Custer.
And the rifles that Custer's troops used, am I correct in calling it a breech loading rifle? And so what you had to do is you had to put every single shot in manually, right?
And the thing is, after they reported, even before the battle, the troops that used these things reported that after every third or fourth shot, the bullet would get stuck in the breech because it was hot from repeated use, and they were in these copper-clad shells, and the copper would get hot, it would expand, and they would have to pry the shot out of the breach before they could put another one in. So that would slow them up too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's on my mind, so before I forget it, are you going to be up at the United County History Center? They're having an author's book signing.
Yeah, we're going to be there. I'm going to be there. My brother Jim's going to be there because he's written several books. He's going to bring some with him. And it's on November 18th, which is a Saturday, I believe from noon to 3 at the Oneida County History Center.
And I'm glad you're going to be there because it really was your idea. So
I try.
Yeah, and Dennis Webster is going to be there, I know, and I don't have the full list, but it's going to be a good time, and hope it becomes an annual event, really.
Yeah, I hope so.
Yeah, because there's now used to be one up in Old Forge at the
Yes.
library every year that went out of business with COVID, I think it was.
Yeah, COVID ruined a lot of things
Yeah.
because there's a lot of places that used to have author things, and they don't do it too much anymore.
Well, I'm glad you're going to be up there. And what books are you going to bring with you?
Oh, I'm going to bring a little of everything.
Okay.
I've got my 8th Air Force series. I've got the Custer books. That's the newest one. I did one on Pearl Harbor that I'm going to have. I got a series on various unsolved mysteries. Each one is a different topic, like UFOs, cryptids, you know, like Bigfoot and that kind of stuff. Famous disappearances. I'll have those there.
The Custer book sells for how much?
Online, I think it's $12.95, but usually when I do one of these author signings, I give them a break of $2 or $3, so probably about $8 to $10. Yeah.
And is the book available where?
I have it, or it's available on Amazon. You can just go on Amazon and Google my name, Cheryl with a C, Pula, P-U-L-A, and anything that I've written that's on Amazon will pop up.
You're also involved with that writers group. Where's that writers group based?
Bridgeport.
Bridgeport.
Yeah, just a little outside of Cicero.
Yeah, when we come back, we ought to talk about that
Okay.
writers group a little bit. Cheryl Pula is our guest. We're talking about her new book, The Little Bighorn, Custer's Last Battle. Short break, right back. And welcome back, everybody. Cheryl Pula is our guest. We're talking about her newest book, and that is The Little Bighorn, Custer's Last Battle. It's available online at Amazon. It's also going to be available when Cheryl goes up to the United County History Center, 1608 Genesee Street, with a bunch of other authors on November
18th.
In the afternoon, and they're going to be having a book signing up there. And we're hoping that's very successful. One of the there's a lot of interesting things about your book, but one of the interesting things, which I've never seen anywhere in reading about Custer and the battle, is you've got a complete list of all the people under his command that died, and this was interesting, I thought, Cheryl. There is a list of 5 guys that were on their way.
Yeah. Talk about lucky.
Yeah. What was going on with them? They just didn't get there in time, huh?
Yeah, they didn't get there in time. They could have been like on detached duty somewhere and were on the way too, because there's a list of guys who were on detached duty. That's why they weren't there. There were some guys that were on sick leave or on furlough and were probably on their way back.
Yeah, and I'm looking at the names now, and it's interesting of the troopers that were killed under Custer's command. It's interesting how many of them were not native to this country.
Oh yeah,
a lot of them from Ireland.
Ireland, there's Ireland, England, Wales, Scotland. There were even some from Eastern Europe. I believe there were a few from the Middle East around there. But there were a lot of foreign-born troops in the Army at that time. Because remember, this is after the Civil War. So a lot of the men who had been in the Civil War had gone back home and didn't want anything else to do with having to be in the Army.
Yeah. You were telling me before the show, Cheryl, that the content derives from your speaking at MVILR,
Right.
Mohawk Valley Independent
Mohawk Valley Institute for Learning and Retirement.
Right.
Yeah.
And you speak down there often, give courses down there often, and you gave a course on this?
Yeah, a couple of years ago I gave a 4-week course on the battle, dividing it up to what happened before, from the cavalry side, from the Indian side, and then what happened after.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And was that well attended?
Oh yeah, I pretty much had a full house. I think they have like 35 or 40 in each class, and I have had probably about 35 or 36.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
And you're teaching up there now?
Yeah, right now I've got 1 more week left to a 4-week course on Orson Welles' The War of the Worlds broadcast that happened in 1938.
And the anniversary was Tuesday, right?
The anniversary is the 30th of October. Yep.
Okay.
The night before Halloween.
The night before, okay.
Yep.
What made that so? I mean, you read accounts today, and it sounds like it got pretty wild there for a while, huh?
A lot of it was hype. They had announced beforehand they were going to do this. And the day of the broadcast, which would have been Sunday morning, October 30th, they had a full-page story in the New York Times entertainment section, front page, saying at 8 p.m. tonight, Orson Welles and his Mercury Theater on the air is going to do a dramatization of Orson Welles' The War of the Worlds. Then when it came on at 8 o'clock, you are listening to the CBS Broadcasting Company, and they had like 4 disclaimers throughout the whole thing. The thing was, the most popular program on the radio at the time what was called Chase and Sanborn Hour. So a lot of people, most everybody tuned into that. And they usually started the program with a music interlude. So people would channel surf on the radio, because remember they didn't have TV then. So they would do like we do. We channel surf on the TV, so they channel surfed on the radio. And Orson Welles knew how long it took for that opening segment of the Chase and Sanborn Hour. So he knew within X number of minutes they were going to be channel surfing and probably turning over to CBS, which is what he was on. And that's when he started some of these, we interrupt this program to bring you this special news bulletin, this thing has landed in New Jersey and all this. And people would stop and they would listen, and they had missed the disclaimer saying that it was fictional. And by the time they got 40 minutes into the program, which is when the next break was, because they didn't have commercials, people thought it was real. And if you listen to it without, thinking about the fact of what's going to happen, I can see why people might have thought it was real, because it sounded real, the way they did it.
You were giving some numbers to me before the show. Where did those numbers, talk about that, the numbers that thought it was real and the...
Well, at the time there was, how we had the Nielsen's?
Yeah.
They had what was called the Crosley service. And they estimated that 17 million people heard the War of the Worlds broadcast. Of that 17 million, 12 million thought it might be real. Is it real or isn't it? And about 1.2 million of those people thought it was real, because they tuned in the middle, and by that time the Martians were leveling New York City or Newark or whatever it happened to be. And a lot of this hype that you hear about people jumping out of buildings and killing themselves never happened. It's like an urban legend. Because at the time, radio was only like 10 years old. And the newspapers saw it as competition, because people could get their news faster via the radio than they could via the newspapers. And they didn't want radio to be successful. So they came up with all these stories about how people heard this, thought the Martians were invading and they were killing themselves, and none of it really happened.
Yeah. Back to Custer for a second.
Yeah.
His legacy is, I think in great part, is it not due to his wife?
Oh, yes.
Didn't she work hard?
Oh, yeah. He died in 1876 at the Little Bighorn. She passed away, I think, in 1933 or thereabouts. So she, outlived him by quite a bit, and she never remarried. And pretty much from the minute that the news broke that he had died, she started with this whole what they call Custer myth thing. that everybody was to blame for what happened to the Little Bighorn except him. Reno was to blame, Benteen was to blame, the other generals were to blame, and all this kind of thing. And she spent her whole life, you know, perpetuating the myth of Custer, that he was pretty much invincible and the best general we ever had in the world. And that's pretty much where it came from, was from her efforts.
Yeah. What was her first name?
Elizabeth. They called her Libby.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And didn't she have a sister? I'm trying to think.
I believe she did.
Yeah.
In fact, because if I recall, her father, who was a judge, they lived on Monroe, Michigan, wanted Custer to court her sister because he wasn't good enough for Libby. They didn't want their daughter to marry a common soldier, even though it was the middle of the Civil War and he was pretty much a hero by then. You know.
We've only got a few seconds left, but didn't Custer also have a brother who was with him at the battle?
He had two brothers, a cousin and a nephew with him at the Little Bighorn, all of whom died.
Okay. You're going to be signing the book, among other books, at the United County History Center on Saturday, November 18th.
Yep.
And we should remind people that on November 4th, I'm going to be up there with Frank Tomeno and Dave Didyak and Pam Spearback. We're going to talk about the history of newspapers. Thanks for coming in. Good luck with this book.
Sure, thank you.
We didn't get to a bunch of other stuff we wanted to, so we'll have to have you come back.
Okay.
All right. That's going to do it for us this week. We'll be back next week. We'll do it all again. Don't forget cnyhomepage.com. There's lots of good stuff there. Until next time, take care of yourself, everybody.